Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about religion. Religion is universal. Everyone has a religion, including those who insist they don't. Those who say they have no religion just mean they don't believe in a god, typically. But that isn't really what a religion is, even if some insist this is how the dictionary defines the word. It's not, but that's for another day. Religion is also something that was never invented. It is instead emergent from consciousness. The human animal thinks in terms of narrative and mythos. In part, this is due to how the human mind evolved. As much as we like to talk about humans as rational animals, and especially in today's world we prefer to think of ourselves as scientific and logical, but the truth of the human animal is that men were not designed to think in a flat and strictly logical way, at least in the way we understand logic. We typically envision logic as a sort of mechanical process, detached from emotion, detached from everyday ramifications or mere perception. Logic is free from the hindrances that come with passions or that come with desires. Logic is pure. It is essentially mathematics. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. If premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, then premise 3 must also be true, and thus the conclusion is X. Logic is procedural. This is how we tend to conceptualize logic, at least. But in practice, logic is not quite so neat and clean. But what's more, if we think of logic as this mechanical, detached process, which means that logic is largely about abstractions. And by abstractions, I mean in the academic sense. An abstraction is a core concept. The problem is, we live in the real world. We don't live in the realm of thought. And since we live in the real world, we deal with objective material realities. We don't deal in abstractions. And our ancient ancestors lived in a very dangerous world, where their primary concerns were keeping themselves alive, keeping their group and families alive, and meeting their basic needs. To do this, they needed to be able to find food, to shelter from the elements, and to avoid dangers. They needed to avoid injury. They needed to avoid illness. They needed to avoid animals that could harm them, or even other humans that could harm them. They did not set about thinking of detached, unconnected abstractions. They were not trying to think of an idyllic world. They were not trying to come up with a utopia. They were simply trying to navigate and live in the world that they actually lived in. This is why the human mind works the way it does. It makes snap decisions very rapidly, often based upon a combination of instinct and preconditioning, which is brought on by memory, experience, and education. We often fall back on what we already know, which is generally conceptualized in our mind as a sort of overarching narrative, which is a form of story that doesn't have specific characters, but rather has archetypes and expectations, certain roles that we know are filled by certain things. Child, father, mother, grandmother, grandfather, enemy, friend, things like that. If you're familiar with literature and writing, they have identified either 7 basic plots or 9 basic plots, depending on how you break them down, but they are essentially what I'm talking about. If you read the outlines of the basic plots, or even the now infamous hero's journey, it will tell you things like protagonist begins a quest to find item. Protagonist needs item to save kingdom. Protagonist has faithful companion who travels with him and assists him. They must face evil army led by some sort of evil foe, such as a Dark Lord. What I'm presenting is a story, but it doesn't have definitive answers to what exactly is going on. It doesn't tell you who the protagonist is, for example. And I don't just mean by his name. We don't know anything else about him, how he dresses, what he looks like, what kind of personality he has. We just know he's the protagonist, and that he's going on a quest to find an item. We don't know what the item is. We don't really know who's leading the villains who oppose him. But we know these elements exist, and you can plug in any number of characters and scenarios into this world, and fit it into this framework that I just told you. That's what a narrative is. And that's actually how the human mind works. It works by telling stories, not by sitting down and critically analyzing everything. And even the most staunch militant atheist who has forsworn religion and believes totally in logic and science and evidence doesn't actually separate himself from the way the human mind works. They say they do, but they are not thinking like computers. They are not looking at a pure mathematical formula and coming up with a logical, rational solution. They are thinking in terms of the narratives they have accepted. That isn't to say that once you have accepted a narrative, you cannot change your mind about it with given evidence or new experiences, but when militant atheists talk about how logical and rational they are often just deceiving themselves. They are not as logical or as rational as they like to pretend to be, or as they like to think of themselves as. They are just as susceptible as others to groupthink, following charismatic leaders, and stereotypical thinking. The problem with militant atheists is that because they won't admit this, they can never truly learn to rise above it. We will never, if we are human, be able to abandon this, though, because it is what makes people human. It is what is fundamental. But once you understand that you are engaged in this mental process, you can then analyze whether or not your assumptions are true. But if you deny making assumptions and are just basing it on pure logic, reason, and evidence, when you really aren't, then you are not going to subject your beliefs to any sort of scrutiny. And that brings us back to religion. Religious belief is rooted in answering the questions that give us a sense of place and understanding. It is a framework which we use to understand the world around us and our place in it. It explains the nature of the world we live in, where it came from, where we came from, who we are, and how we should live. Religion exists to answer these basic questions, and to put it in a meaningful framework that we can engage in. Some would say we no longer need religion because we have science, but that simply makes science a religion. It does not really replace religion with anything. What's more, since science was never designed to answer certain philosophical questions, we inevitably add things to science so that what we are calling science is not really science. And that's because, purely speaking, science will never give us the type of answers that religion gives us on certain things. Science can go through the mechanics of how someone steals something. Science can explain how sex works and how reproduction happens. Science can explain how someone died by the direct physical actions of another person. But science cannot tell you it is wrong to steal. Science cannot make a distinction between a married couple having sex as part of a natural, healthy marriage relationship and adultery, or a man visiting a prostitute. Science cannot make a distinction between someone who is being killed in self-defense and someone who is being murdered for no reason. Science has no moral value to it. I am not saying that to claim that science is evil or immoral. Science is, properly speaking, amoral, and I mean that in the literal sense. Science has no morality. People have morality, and their morality comes from the way they understand the world. Today we often call this a worldview. And we'll often say that everyone has a worldview, not everyone has a religion. But a worldview and a religion are the same thing. And ultimately, if someone who believes in science has a moral code that includes not stealing and not hurting others and not murdering people, they have religious beliefs. Because those things don't come from science. Then again, the idea that if something is scientific, it is not religious, is a conceit of the modern world. I would contend that many of the things that science can answer and that are in its purview are still religious. I am not a creationist. I accept the theory of evolution. But I also recognize the theory of evolution is a religious concept. I do not mean that it is based on faith the way modern atheists say. I am not saying evolution is something that is not backed by evidence. Faith doesn't mean belief without evidence. And I don't believe that religious belief is inherently built around believing things you have no evidence for. When I say evolution is a religious belief, it is not to demean or tear it down. When I say evolution is a religious belief, I say that it is a creation narrative that explains where we came from a purely psychological or literary stance. The way we understand evolution is as a story about how we got here as life forms. It is no different than the Genesis creation account, the Hindu creation account, the creation accounts found in Taoism. The details of how it happened differ, certainly. But the reason we care about this topic is because there is an innate desire to know where we came from. It is that desire that fuels our research into such matters. Evolutionary theory serves the same role as a creation story and it is a creation story. It is inherently religious. So is Big Bang Theory, and, for that matter, the story of dinosaurs going extinct because an asteroid hit the Earth has become a part of our religious culture. It is a story that explains something about the distant past. Religion is comprised of explanatory myths, and by myth, I don't mean a story that is not true. A myth is a story that contains timeless truths and principles that transcend its historical reality. A myth can be a completely true story where absolutely no embellishments happen, and still be a myth if the story has meaning beyond simply the facts at hand. The story of the American Revolution and America's founders struggling against the tyranny of King George III to bring freedom is a myth. The events of the American Revolution happened, though I would contend they did not happen as most people believe they did happen. But what makes it a myth is not that it didn't happen, or even that it has been romanticized so that it includes elements that are not real. What makes it a myth is that the American Revolution is something Americans and now the world look to argue against monarchy and to justify the existence of the United States, and to serve as living avatars for the philosophy on which America was founded. In many ways, stories of the Pilgrim Fathers, of the early colonies, and of America's founders are similar to the stories in the Bible of Abraham and Moses, and how God promised Abraham the promised land to his descendants, and how Moses led the children of Israel out of slavery. They are similar because they describe the origins of a people and nation. They are a national origin story that define where that nation came from and what its principles are and what it is founded upon. And that is what religion is. In our world, we make a distinction between philosophy and religion, just as we make a distinction between science and religion, or for that matter, between science and philosophy. These things are clearly distinct things. Some people recognize, though, that philosophy and religion and science often overlap, but they believe that this just means it has fuzzy borders that overlap at the edges. I have always contended that philosophy and religion are the same thing. There is no distinction, just as there is no distinction between culture and religion. Religious belief is inherently about how we understand the world and our own identities within the world, and how we can engage in it. Ritual in religion helps us to reinforce our values as well as feel connected to them, especially if they are abstract. While the human mind is capable of understanding abstractions, things become real only if they seem real, which is why we tell stories. Because even though a story may be entirely fictional, it can embody certain ideas and make them seem real and solid to us by showing us these principles in action. And ritual does the same thing, showing us a physical representation of the ideal. And even a society of atheists will have rituals, and will have its own mythologies, its own narratives, its own stories. It will uphold famous scientists like Darwin and Einstein and Carl Sagan, in the same way that the Catholic Church holds up saints. It will develop its own story of how once there was this evil force called religion, which science had to vanquish for humanity to live. It will develop stories about why it's wrong to do this or that. And it will reinforce those with ritual behaviors, which may or may not be called rituals in such a society, but they would be. Even national rituals, like saluting a flag or standing when a national anthem hits or holding certain holidays, are all forms of ritualism. It is an inherent aspect of the human animal to do these things, and that is why you will never be rid of religion, and why religion is the foundation of humanity. I don't have much else to say in this particular video. I hope you have found it informative and enjoyable. I will sign off now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.